Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're peeling back the layers of a single, utterly chaotic 24-hour cycle, November 2025.
And this is not a typical news day, not by a long shot.
No, it really felt like a pivot point. We saw these huge global crises, climate, military, financial, and institutional, all sort of converge and just reach their boiling points at the same time.
It was a day that laid bare the world's most acute vulnerabilities. I mean, you had climate diplomacy in Brazil, literally, and I mean literally interrupted by fire.
Yeah.
At the same time, you've got these dramatic and very contested military shifts in Ukraine.
And that's happening alongside a highly controversial peace plan being floated.
Exactly. And then you have financial markets getting whiplash from, well, a combination of really ambiguous labor data and this massive, maybe unstable concentration of wealth in the AI sector.
Exactly. So what's critical for you to grasp today is how these seemingly distant events are actually connected. A fire in the Amazon rainforest and a judge's ruling on the DC National Guard. They seem totally separate, but they're connected by this core theme.
Which is?
The profound, ongoing global challenge to institutional trust and stability.
Right. Our mission here is to synthesize these high-stakes events quickly and thoroughly. We have a dense stack of diverse reports covering, well, everything.
Geopolitics, environmental summits, defense policy leaks, U.S. domestic law.
In global financial markets. So we're going to break down what you need to know about this pivotal cycle.
We want to connect the threads of climate science, kinetic warfare, technological disruption, and the challenging state of democratic systems.
And we'll spend the time necessary to really unpack the detail.
That's the idea. So you get the nuggets of knowledge that make you well-informed, not just broadly aware. Okay, let's unpack this. Starting with the literal heat of the climate crisis and the incredible fragility of global diplomacy at the UN summit in South America.
So we begin in Belém, Brazil. It's the city chosen to host the 30th UN Climate Conference.
And the location itself, right in the Amazon, was chosen for a reason, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It was meant to be deeply symbolic, to underscore the rainforest's existential importance in, stabilizing the global climate.
But that symbolism was, well, it was kind of undermined by a very visceral reminder of instability.
Visceral is the right word. Infrastructural and diplomatic instability all at once.
And that instability was a literal fire. On November 20, a major blaze broke out.
Right in the middle of everything. It was in a cluster of pavilions dedicated to nations in key thematic areas.
And the reports say it originated near some pretty major players.
That's right. The first reports confirmed the fire started near the China Pavilion and then spread into areas housing the Africa Pavilions and some other cultural exhibits inside this massive converted airport complex.
So this wasn't some small incident on the periphery. This was central.
An immediate, full-blown crisis. They had to do a full evacuation of the entire venue.
And do we know the cause?
Well, the early reports point strongly to an electrical fault, possibly just, equipment failure. It speaks to the sheer logistical challenge of fitting all this sophisticated infrastructure into a quickly converted space.
The damage, though, was immediate.
And severe. 13 people were treated for smoke inhalation, and the entire site had to be shut down for hours while officials conducted safety sweeps.
The impact here is so profound because of the timing. These talks always run on an impossible schedule.
And they were at a highly sensitive moment. Negotiations were already stalled on two of the biggest decisions.
Which were?
First, a final global commitment roadmap to phase out fossil fuels, the big one. And second, the crucial financial packages needed to help developing nations adapt and transition.
So to have everything suspended at that exact moment.
It felt like a crushing metaphor for the entire climate movement, an avoidable safety failure grinding everything to a halt.
And how did the delegations react?
With immediate and palpable anger. You have to understand, for delegations from vulnerable island nations and developing states, this work is existential.
Of course.
So for it to be derailed by what they saw as just basic managerial incompetence, it fed directly into this narrative that the industrialized world, or maybe global bureaucracy in general, just cannot take their crisis seriously.
And the observers were worried about the deal itself.
Oh, absolutely. They were quick to warn that this disruption would push final decisions past the planned end date. And when that happens, you increase the probability of a weaker, less ambitious final deal on emissions or finance.
You lose momentum.
You lose momentum, and entrenched positions just solidify. When you lose hours in high-stakes diplomacy, you might as well have lost days.
But even in the midst of this chaos, there was a success story that emerged, right?
There was, and it's important we don't lose sight of it. Our sources confirmed that over 80 countries managed to formalize a really significant new pact, a roadmap to phase out fossil fuels.
So this wasn't just a general statement of intent.
No, not at all. This was more concrete. The roadmap included specific commitments on reducing subsidies and setting actual benchmarks for the energy transition.
And what about the developing nations?
That was the crucial part. It specifically focuses on providing tailored support and finance for them, recognizing that you can't just expect them to transition away from energy poverty without significant aid.
So that alignment from 80 countries, that feels like a genuine turning point.
It is. It establishes a critical mass for the phase-out conversation, even if the world's absolute largest emitters haven't signed on in full. It signals a real shift, away from perpetual debate and toward practical implementation.
But, and there's always a but, this global progress immediately hits a brick wall.
The brick wall of domestic U.S. policy.
And this is where the threads really start to fray. Because on the very same day, November 20, the Trump administration announced a sweeping offshore drilling expansion plan.
One that utterly undercuts any international messaging the U.S. might be trying to send.
How big of a reversal are we talking about here?
It's massive, in both scope and historical significance. The plan opens up waters off of California and Florida to new drilling for the first time in decades.
For the first time in decades?
Yes. The mechanism envisions 6 new lease sales off California between 2027 and 2030. These are waters that were protected by decades of bipartisan agreement, mostly following the devastating 1969 Santa Barbara oil spill.
And it wasn't just California?
No, it gets even more aggressive up north. The plan also schedules auctions in the eastern Gulf of Mexico near Florida, but the most dramatic part is the expansion of over 20 lease sales in Alaskan waters.
Specifically opening a new area.
A new, vast area they've dubbed the High Arctic.
And drilling in the Arctic, that comes with a whole different level of risk, doesn't it?
An immense level of risk. Cleanup operations for a spill in icy, remote environments are incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
Some would say impossible.
So the backlash was immediate.
Fierce. And importantly, it was bipartisan.
You had California Governor Gavin Newsom vowing immediate legal action, citing the threat to tourism and coastal ecosystems.
And on the other side, you saw strong opposition from key Florida Republicans. They've long fought to keep the Gulf Coast clear of offshore rigs.
Citing the Deepwater Horizon disaster.
Exactly. They see it as an unacceptable risk.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, how does this domestic expansion really undercut the U.S. position at COP30?
It complicates it completely. It signals to developing nations that while they are being asked to abandon fossil fuels, the U.S. is aggressively ramping up its own domestic supply under an energy dominance agenda.
So it feeds right into that criticism you mentioned earlier.
Precisely. It feeds the exact criticism that the major powers prioritize their own short-term resource security over any kind of collective climate mitigation, regardless of the consequences for the Arctic or coastal regions.
And the consequences of these failures,
Right.
of the policy friction, they're paid by the most vulnerable populations.
Always. And we're already seeing how climate change is profoundly reshaping global agri-food systems.
You mean everything from how we farm to how we eat?
From farm to fork. The research that came out during the summit detailed how climate change is a fundamental threat multiplier for food insecurity.
It's more than just less rain or more heat, right?
It is. Beyond the obvious impacts, we're seeing new pest migrations and actual shifts in the chemistry of the crops themselves.
Help us understand the science there. How does climate change affect the quality of the food?
It's a crucial detail. Studies are showing that elevated atmospheric CO2 levels, while they can sometimes boost plant growth initially, they can lead to this phenomenon called nutritional dilution.
Nutritional dilution?
Basically, some of our staple crops, like rice and wheat, they end up with reduced concentrations of essential micronutrients, things like zinc and iron.
So it's not just that we're producing less food because of drought.
Exactly. The food we are producing may be less nutritionally robust, and for populations already suffering from malnutrition, that's an absolute disaster.
And the finding from the conference was that this agri-food reform has to be central to the talks.
It has to be. But the current climate finance flows are far, far below what's needed for this kind of transformation. And that funding gap directly exacerbates global poverty.
Which brings us directly to a major report that also dropped on November 20.
The UNICEF State of the World's Children 2025 report, released on World Children's Day.
And the key finding is just devastating.
It is. Progress on reducing child poverty has not only stalled, it's now threatened with reversal.
And the primary drivers are what you'd expect.
Overlapping conflict, economic hardship, and, of course, climate shocks.
The scale is just hard to comprehend.
The report estimates that roughly 412 million children worldwide are living in extreme monetary poverty. That's under $3 a day.
And then there's another, even higher number.
417 million children in low and middle-income countries who are severely deprived in at least 2 essential areas.
Meaning things like nutrition, clean water, housing, healthcare.
That's right. And this report is a stark reminder that climate impacts are poverty amplifiers.
How so?
Well, you can see it clearly. A severe storm or a drought, intensified by climate change, wipes out a farmer's livelihood.
And that immediately pushes their children into severe deprivation.
Instantly. So UNICEF is urgently advocating for targeted interventions, things like universal child benefits, cash transfers, something to act as a buffer against these unpredictable climate shocks.
Because climate resilience has to start at the family level.
It has to.
And as if to underline the immediate present-day consequences of this right here in the U.S., on that same day, millions of people were under alerts for severe weather.
Yes, across the central and southern U.S., severe thunderstorms and flash flooding.
The timing and intensity of these storms, hitting massive areas of Texas and surrounding states, it aligns perfectly with what climate scientists have been projecting.
Warmer air holds more moisture,
which leads to more frequent and more intense heavy rainfall events.
And that immediately links these abstract policy debates back to very practical, very expensive questions about infrastructure resilience and disaster preparedness right here at home.
Before we move on from climate, though, let's just briefly acknowledge that conservation win.
Right. Despite the fire at COP30 and the U.S. drilling plan, there was some good news.
70 countries did agree to restrict the trade of critically endangered species.
It's a small but necessary step. And it shows that even when the major powers are failing on the core energy issues, you can still achieve international consensus on something like wildlife protection.
Usually driven by a lot of activist pressure.
A significant amount of pressure, yes.
It's almost the perfect encapsulation of the day, isn't it?
How do you mean?
One step forward for 70 nations on wildlife, one giant step back for the U.S. on oil, and a major diplomatic gathering literally catching on fire. So now we shift from the environmental stage to the battlefield. The war in Ukraine saw some major and highly contested developments on November 20.
And these developments amplified geopolitical anxiety and forced Europe into a very uncomfortable reckoning.
The central development came from Russia's chief of the general staff, Valery Gerasimov.
Right. He was claiming significant battlefield gains directly to President Putin. And the most important claim centered on Kupiansk.
For those who might not be familiar, can you just remind us why Kupiansk is so important?
Kupiansk is far more than just a town. It's a strategic rail and logistics hub in the Kharkiv region.
It's been fought over fiercely before.
Fiercely, and it's changed hands multiple times. Controlling Kupiansk is absolutely key to sustaining supply lines for the entire Eastern Front.
So what was Gerasimov claiming?
He claimed on November 20 that Russian forces had not only taken the city, but had successfully encircled the Ukrainian troops who were still on the left bank of the Oskol River.
And he didn't stop with Kupiansk, did he?
No. The claims extended into the Donetsk region. He alleged the seizure of over 70% of Pokrovsk and more than 80% of Vovchansk.
So if these claims are confirmed?
If they're confirmed, the combined seizure of these areas would represent one of Russia's most significant battlefield successes in months. It would dramatically increase the pressure on Kyiv's forces.
Which are already struggling.
Right. Struggling with manpower and ammunition shortages, all happening amid wavering Western military aid.
Did Ukraine respond to these claims?
Ukrainian officials immediately disputed Gerasimov's account, as you'd expect. But independent analysis does indicate that Russian forces have indeed been making persistent, slow, and brutal incremental gains.
And they're targeting railway junctions specifically.
Which tells you the strategy.
And the timing of these battlefield claims is inextricably linked to something else that was happening.
The simultaneous high-stakes diplomatic pressure being exerted on Ukraine.
Yes, the news that broke about the U.S. pushing a highly controversial peace plan.
Leaked outlines and reports confirmed that a proposal, one that was quietly drafted by U.S. and Russian officials, was being circulated.
And the premise of this plan?
As reported, it's a path to ending the conflict that would require Kyiv to accept some really painful territorial concessions.
Meaning essentially ceding occupied lands.
Ceding occupied lands, and also a major reduction in its military force size.
The international reaction to this was not positive.
It was instantaneous and fiercely negative. especially from key European allies.
The foreign minister of France was very blunt.
He was. He publicly rejected the proposal and flatly described it as capitulation for Ukraine and a dangerous reward for Russian aggression.
So this creates an impossible dilemma for Kyiv.
Absolutely. President Zelensky has consistently warned that forcing a deal now would only embolden Moscow to renew hostilities later.
But the pressure is real.
It is, especially if U.S. military support continues to face these political hurdles in Washington. The debate is really about whether an immediate peace, however painful, is preferable to a long-term military grinding.
And this alleged diplomatic effort was tragically undercut by the reality on the ground?
Yes. On that same day, November 20, Russia launched another deadly wave of missile and drone strikes across Ukraine.
And the human cost was high.
At least 26 people were killed and over 90 injured, including children, in cities like Ternopil.
So this resumption of deadly strikes, it just makes any peace effort that much harder.
It does. It raises global condemnation, and it reinforces the European argument that Russia isn't genuinely interested in negotiating anything short of absolute military victory and political submission.
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting for me. How does this combination of events, disputed losses, a controversial peace plan, deadly missile strikes, how does that fundamentally change the European defense conversation?
Well, the psychological shift across the continent is palpable.
It seems to have moved beyond just solidarity with Ukraine.
It's moved to a sense of self-preservation. And that shift was dramatically crystallized in a highly charged speech from the French Chief of the Defense Staff, General Fabien Mandin.
I was genuinely floored when I read the details of that speech.
It was a brutal and unsettling message. He argued that France must be psychologically and logistically prepared to lose its children.
Meaning accepting mass casualties.
Accepting mass casualties in a future war with Russia, which he predicted could happen within the next 5 years.
That is an extraordinary warning from a high-ranking military leader in a major NATO nation.
It is. General Mandin argued that Russia is fundamentally rearming and preparing for a wider confrontation with Europe, regardless of what happens in Ukraine.
So his core message was that French society has become complacent.
Complacent. And that it needed to accept the painful possibility of high casualties if deterrence fails.
And this triggered a political firestorm, I assume.
A genuine firestorm.
Yeah.
Opposition parties immediately accused him of warmongering and trying to normalize the idea of high military losses.
But his defenders had a different take.
They argued he was simply stating the uncomfortable strategic truth, that Europe is dangerously unprepared for the scale of the threat Russia poses. It's forcing a much-needed, if very difficult, debate.
And the fallout from that is already happening.
Oh, yes. It's sharpening debates over defense spending, the necessity of reintroducing national conscription, and the overall pace of military readiness across the whole continent.
But it also gives Moscow a propaganda tool.
An immediate one. They can use it to paint NATO as the aggressor preparing for direct war, which just further escalates the cycle of mistrust.
Okay, let's move south now to the Middle East, where we also saw escalating tensions.
And a breakdown of security, starting with the resumption of Israeli strikes on Gaza.
The ceasefire broke down.
Immediately. Reports confirmed that renewed Israeli strikes on the night of November 19th and into the 20th killed at least 32 Palestinians, including several children.
And the justification from Israeli officials.
They stated these were necessary responses to renewed rocket launches from Gaza, but the immediate human cost drew renewed international scrutiny.
And at the same time, there was heightened scrutiny on another issue.
Escalating Israeli settler violence in the occupied West Bank. We saw specific, detailed reports of attacks on Palestinian vehicles and fires being set in areas like Huwara.
The reports indicated that the violence was increasing.
Yes, that the preceding month had seen the highest number of recorded settler attacks since systematic monitoring began.
And how did the Israeli government respond?
Prime Minister Netanyahu addressed the issue by convening a security cabinet meeting, but he drew criticism for how he described it.
He called them a handful of extremists.
Right. And critics argued that this description minimizes the scale of the problem and ignores the long-standing issue of impunity for these kinds of actions.
And crucially, the international community is moving beyond just words.
They are. Singapore joined several other nations in imposing targeted travel bans and financial sanctions on specific Israeli settlers accused of severe violence.
That is highly significant.
Very. Sanctions are a serious tool. And to have them applied by non-traditional players like Singapore, it signals a growing international willingness to apply direct pressure on individual actors.
Trying to force the Israeli government to step up law enforcement in the West Bank?
That's the goal.
We also saw the U.S. Treasury target Iran's funding apparatus on November 20.
Yes, they announced new sanctions aimed at the core financial engine of Iran's military and its proxy operations.
And this targeted what they called Iran's shadow fleet.
Right, a complex web of front companies, shell corporations, and oil tankers that are used to evade existing sanctions.
It's a whole system designed to mask where the oil is coming from.
A whole system. Ship-to-ship transfers, falsified manifests, convoluted insurance arrangements, all designed to mask the origin of Iranian crude sales.
And that money funds proxy groups.
Especially following the 12-day war with Israel. These sanctions aim to choke off that funding lifeline.
And finally, a highly controversial development out of Lebanon.
Yes, reports were confirmed regarding Israel's use of cluster munitions in recent airstrikes there.
Specifically targeting Palestinian refugee camps.
Which drew immediate global condemnation. These weapons, which disperse smaller submunitions over a wide area, they're banned by most international conventions.
Because they're indiscriminate.
Indiscriminate, and there's a high risk that unexploded ordnance causes to civilians long after the conflict ends. Using them in densely populated areas like refugee camps is viewed by international bodies as a serious violation of humanitarian law.
All right, let's transition now to the global financial system, which for a while now has been riding this massive wave of technological optimism.
A wave driven almost entirely by the spectacular success of a handful of companies.
Primarily NVIDIA, the engine of the AI boom.
Right. And this huge concentration of wealth has fueled persistent speculation that we are living through, or maybe in, an AI bubble.
And that bubble anxiety met a complex and contradictory reality check on November 20.
With a long-delayed U.S. jobs report.
Yes. Because of prior government shutdowns, key economic data had been held back, so the market was desperate for some kind of clarity on the Federal Reserve's future path for interest rates.
And what the market got was ambiguous.
Oh.
Which is often worse than clearly bad news.
Okay, so break it down for us. Non-farm payrolls grew by 119,000 jobs.
Which was a strong number, more than double what some economists had forecast. It suggested an underlying strength in the economy.
But here's the kicker that spooked investors.
The unemployment rate also ticked up to 4.4%, reaching its highest level in nearly 4 years. And this combination created a genuine conundrum for analysts.
So help us break down that ambiguity. Why would strong payroll numbers, more jobs being created, happen at the same time as a rising unemployment rate?
Well, the most likely explanation is that the labor force participation rate went up significantly.
Meaning more people started looking for work.
Exactly. More people who had been sitting on the sidelines decided to start looking for jobs. And when more people enter the labor force but haven't immediately found a job, the unemployment rate rises, even if the absolute number of jobs created is high.
So the market had to grapple with two completely contradictory signals.
Right. Strong hiring, which suggests the Fed needs to keep rates high to fight inflation, and rising unemployment, which suggests the economy might be weakening and needs rate cuts.
And so those initial hopes for a Goldilocks soft landing scenario, they faded pretty fast.
Rapidly. As investors digested that data, concerns resurfaced about how overextended the speculative bets on AI had become.
And that triggered a sharp market sell-off, especially in tech.
The tech-heavy NASDAQ dropped over 2%. The S&P 500 fell about 1.6%. And this volatility immediately shifted projections for monetary policy.
Morgan Stanley changed their call.
They did, a major voice on Wall Street, and they dropped their long-held call for a December Fed rate cut. Now they're projecting the first rate reductions won't happen until 2026.
And that projection shift, pushing rate cuts back by months, that has profound implications for average Americans, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It impacts mortgage rates, credit card debt, the overall cost of borrowing. It suggests the financial pain is going to persist longer than people previously hoped.
And the irony here is that the supposed engine of all this, NVIDIA, actually reported stellar earnings.
That's right. The company reported quarterly results that significantly exceeded analyst forecasts, all driven by record-setting demand for its high-powered AI chips.
CEO Jensen Huang validated that demand.
He did, noting robust international sales. But even that good news was tempered.
How so?
He acknowledged rising concerns about persistent supply limits, the fact they just can't manufacture enough chips quickly enough, and crucially, he also addressed the ethical and moral implications of developing such advanced AI.
which is a growing focus for regulators globally.
A huge focus.
What's fascinating here, and what really drives that bubble anxiety, is the market divergence you mentioned.
Yes. Despite NVIDIA's spectacular profits, many other chip makers and crypto-like stocks were among the biggest losers in the sharp sell-off.
And that reinforces the idea that the AI boom is currently powered by too few winners.
It does.
So why would good news for NVIDIA translate into bad news for the rest of the sector?
It signals the market's realization that the barriers to entry in the high-end AI chip space are, well, they're nearly insurmountable.
Only NVIDIA has the scale and the software ecosystem.
Right.
Yeah.
To capture the bulk of the demand. So investors are realizing that the flood of capital going into AI doesn't lift all boats. It just lifts one massive ship. And that shifted money away from the second-tier chip stocks, leading to their sharp decline.
And in stark contrast to all this tech volatility,
You had consumer retail giants like Walmart jumping on strong reports.
detailing robust online sales and effective use of their digital advertising revenue.
And this just underscores a widening critical gap between the performance of speculative technology investment and the steadier immediate health of the consumer economy.
So the real economy of goods and services is holding up, while the speculative capital markets are showing extreme nervousness.
That's a perfect way to put it.
All right, we're going to turn inward now to the United States, where institutional trust and the legal boundaries of executive power were severely challenged across multiple high-profile cases on November 20.
The first major story is a significant legal rebuke concerning the use of military forces for domestic purposes.
This refers to the ruling from U.S. District Judge Gia Cobb in Washington, D.C.
Yes, she ruled that the Trump administration's deployment of roughly 2,000 D.C. Guard troops was illegal.
And these were troops activated without the usual requests from the D.C. mayor.
Exactly. Judge Cobb's finding was that the president lacked the constitutional authority to unilaterally use the Guard for broad crime deterrence. Her ruling really targeted the administration's sweeping interpretation of its Article II powers.
It's important to understand the context here, isn't it? The deployment strategy was highly criticized.
It was, because it risks violating the Posse Comitatus Act, which generally prohibits using federal military forces for domestic law enforcement.
And the judge found that the administration overstepped.
Specifically, by sending 1,000 out-of-state Guard members for duties related to law enforcement without proper legal grounding and without authorization from Congress, which plays a unique role in governing the Capitol.
So this ruling is a major victory for checks and balances.
And it underscores a deep judicial skepticism about the militarization of domestic policing, which has been a major flashpoint during civil unrest.
The legal fight isn't over, though.
No, the ruling was temporarily delayed to allow for an appeal, but it sets a critical precedent that the military cannot simply be deployed as a general police force at the executive's discretion.
And compounding this whole conflict over military law, President Trump dramatically escalated tensions with Congress on the same day.
He publicly called for the arrest of Democratic lawmakers who had issued an open letter to U.S. service members.
These were lawmakers like Senator Mark Kelly and Representative Adam Schiff.
Yes, and their letter was a reminder to troops of their duty to refuse any unlawful orders. A fairly common legal reminder amid concerns that the military might be used for politically motivated operations.
But the president accused them of sedition.
Sedition. And he went further, suggesting their actions were potentially punishable by death under military law.
This raises an important question, though. The president's threat is legally irrelevant, right? So why did the lawmakers even bother to issue the letter if the law is so clear?
That's a critical point. The legal reality is absolute. U.S. military law, specifically the Uniform Code of Military Justice, or UCMJ, it explicitly requires troops to disobey unlawful orders.
And that's drilled into them during training.
Constantly. So the president's threat is legally groundless. The lawmakers issued the letter not because the law was unclear, but because the political environment had created what they perceived as an ethical boundary crisis.
It was more of a political statement.
Exactly. It was designed to shore up constitutional norms and remind service members of their oath to the Constitution, not to a single person.
So the president's remarks were primarily authoritarian rhetoric.
Aimed at intimidating critics and politicizing the armed forces, rather than a reflection of any actual UCMJ statutes. It was an attack on the bedrock principle of civilian control of the military.
Okay, moving to accountability and transparency. November 20 saw a major political victory for advocates seeking clarity on high-level scandals.
President Trump signed a bill mandating that the Department of Justice must release all documents related to Jeffrey Epstein within 30 days.
The political pressure for that was immense.
It was. The bill received near unanimous support in Congress. However, while the mandate is strong, the controversy immediately shifted.
To whether the administration would redact or withhold sensitive information.
Right, citing national security or protecting ongoing investigations, a maneuver that could seriously control or sanitize the narrative.
And we saw immediate, concrete professional fallout tied to this scandal.
We did. Former U.S. Treasury Secretary Larry Summers announced he was stepping down from teaching at Harvard.
And he also resigned from the board of the powerful AI company OpenAI.
This departure came very quickly after documents surfaced showing regular and long-running communication between Summers and Epstein, even after Epstein's previous conviction.
So it was a defensive move.
Clearly, aimed at insulating the institutions he served. And it raises profound questions about accountability. Leaders, regardless of their past stature, are being forced to distance themselves from even the perception of scandal in this hyper-scrutinized environment.
Now, while all the scrutiny was falling on outside actors, the Justice Department itself was facing its own intense scrutiny.
Yes, due to significant procedural lapses discovered in the high-profile case against former FBI Director James Comey.
This is a truly remarkable legal development.
It is. Under judicial scrutiny, it was revealed that the grand jury in the Comey case never actually saw the final corrected version of his indictment before they approved it.
So what's the procedural risk here? Why does that matter so much?
A grand jury indictment has to be based on the facts that are presented to them. If the final document that goes to trial differs substantially from what they approved, it can be seen as a violation of the Fifth Amendment right to a grand jury indictment.
And legal observers are taking this very seriously.
They're warning that this lapse is serious enough that it could potentially result in the dismissal of the case or significant sanctions. And of course, it just fuels the claims that the entire prosecution was politically motivated and rushed.
Which undermines the DOJ's impartiality. And adding to concerns over governmental ethics, we also saw an indictment of a sitting member of Congress.
Florida Congresswoman Sheila Cherfilus McCormick was indicted for allegedly diverting $5 million in federal disaster funds.
Specifically FEMA overpayments.
Yes, overpayments intended for her family's healthcare company, which were allegedly used for personal expenses and her campaign. It just revives all these concerns over pandemic-era fraud and the ethical standards of elected officials.
Amidst all this chaos, though, there was one small bipartisan victory for oversight.
There was. The House voted unanimously to rescind a provision that would have allowed 8 Republican senators to sue the government if their phone records were seized as part of the January 6th probe.
A welcome move to restore some checks on legislator privilege.
Yes, but perhaps the most alarming institutional failure of the day involved the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC.
And this strikes directly at the core of scientific trust and public health.
It does. The CDC quietly altered its vaccine safety webpage.
The change in language is just astonishing.
It is. The CDC's new wording now states that the claim vaccines do not cause autism is not an evidence-based statement.
Which for decades, the CDC's messaging, backed by exhaustive consensus science, has been the complete opposite.
This is not a subtle shift. This is a fundamental, radical contradiction of decades of established scientific consensus.
And the reports indicate this change didn't go through the normal process.
It bypassed standard, rigorous internal scientific and legal review processes within the CDC. And it's reportedly linked directly to the personal insistence of HHS Secretary Kennedy, who is a noted vaccine skeptic.
And the public health community's reaction.
They were quick to condemn the revision as institutionalized misinformation. They warned that this could have catastrophic real-world consequences.
Fueling renewed outbreaks of preventable diseases like measles.
Measles, whooping cough, by deterring parents from immunization. When the nation's highest public health authority deviates from consensus science without transparent, evidence-based reasoning, it causes irreversible damage to its credibility.
The damage to institutional trust in science might be the most lasting failure of this turbulent day.
It very well could be.
But on a final positive note for the U.S. bureaucracy, the Department of Veterans Affairs announced a major financial relief measure.
Right. They announced they would wipe out over $272 million in backlogged medical bills for veterans.
And this covered co-payments and other charges that accrued during a processing pause?
Yes. It addressed a significant, long-standing bureaucratic failing and provided immediate financial relief to those who served. A rare piece of good news. Okay, moving from institutional integrity to the integrity of physical systems, the National Transportation Safety Board, the NTSB, released its preliminary report on that deadly November 4 UPS cargo plane crash.
The MD-11 that went down in Louisville, Kentucky, 14 people killed.
Yes, and this report immediately focused on a frightening structural failure.
The NTSB findings were chilling. They released these high-resolution photographs showing that the left engine and its massive mounting pylon had just detached.
Completely detached during the takeoff roll, flew over the wing, and resulted in a massive, unsurvivable fire.
And the early analysis is pointing to what?
Overstress failure and fatigue cracks in key components of the engine mount structure.
Which suggests a long-developing issue of metal fatigue.
A common problem in aging airframes, but one that reached a catastrophic failure point under the extreme stress of takeoff. And this raises immediate serious concerns about the inspection and maintenance regimes for older cargo aircraft fleets globally.
And the MD-11 is a workhorse, isn't it? Used heavily in global freight.
It's a total workhorse. So if the NTSB confirms systemic, unaddressed issues with these engine mounts, or if the inspection protocols were just inadequate, regulators could be forced to mandate urgent fleet-wide modifications.
Or even grounding similar older aircraft.
Which would immensely disrupt global air freight capacity.
And this incident is renewing a critical, long-standing debate.
It is. Should cargo airlines, which often fly older aircraft and prioritize minimizing downtime, be held to exactly the same stringent safety and inspection standards as passenger carriers?
The loss of 14 lives demands that review.
A profound structural review, yes. It's another example of a system we view as highly reliable aviation safety exhibiting an unexpected, catastrophic failure at the point of physical stress.
And finally, as we cataloged this global cascade of crisis and market jitters and institutional failure, November 20 did offer one massive cultural counterpoint.
A bizarre one, yes.
The announcement was made that a single ticket holder had claimed a Mega Millions jackpot worth nearly $1 billion in the U.S.
It's a funny, almost absurd bookend to the day, isn't it?
It really is.
While the entire global financial system was questioning the stability of the AI boom and nations were worried about the costs of war and climate change, one single person solved all their financial problems.
Achieving immediate, life-changing stability through the purest form of volatility and luck. Hashtag out UTRO, synthesis and provocation. So let's circle back and try to synthesize the conflicting extreme movements of this single pivotal day.
It's a lot to pull together.
It is. We saw the diplomatic struggle for climate survival literally interrupted by fire. We saw major war concessions being floated alongside a shocking warning from France to prepare for a wider conflict.
And the financial world reeled from that concentrated AI speculation hitting the wall of ambiguous labor data.
So the common thread running through all 5 of these sections: the environmental chaos, the military escalation, the market jitters, the legal conflicts, the safety report. It's this profound, pervasive challenge to institutional trust.
I think that's exactly right. The mechanisms we all rely on for stable facts and for effective governance, they seem to be fracturing.
Right. The CDC ignores decades of scientific consensus to alter a key health claim. The Justice Department is undermined by procedural flaws and high-profile political prosecution.
International climate diplomacy literally catches fire.
And the U.S. military's fundamental role is questioned by federal judges and lawmakers.
So, what does this all mean? The demand for accountability is peaking. You can see it everywhere.
You see it in the consequences for Larry Summers, in the mandate to release the Epstein files, in the major judicial rebuke of the D.C. Guard deployment. The public demand for transparency is higher than it has been in decades.
But, and this is the key conflict, that demand for accountability is running directly into overwhelming evidence of systemic, foundational failure.
The Comey indictment flaw, the CDC statement, the MD-11 fatigue cracks. We are living through this period where the demand for trustworthy facts is at its absolute highest.
But the very mechanisms designed to provide those trusted facts, science, justice, diplomacy, safety regulation, are themselves showing clear evidence of compromise and fracture.
So here's the final thought for you to mull over. What happens to a complex global system when the demand for transparency is highest, but the institutions we rely on for stability, for safety, and for verifiable truth appear fundamentally compromised?
If you can't trust the science from the CDC, or the legal process from the DOJ, or even the basic safety of a UN conference, where does society turn to establish objective reality?
That's something for you to think about as we wrap up this deep dive into the 24 hours of November 20, 2025.